is one of the nation's and possibly the world's experts in public management, and has said quite a lot over the years about intersectoral governance and public policy implementation problems. And Larry actually started out as a chemistry PhD student in theoretical chemistry at Harvard back in the 90s, I believe. Yeah. Just a little bit before me. And
1890s.
Yeah. So Larry has has a varied background and is a very interesting person, and I'm very pleased to have him. So let's welcome him.
Well, thanks, Tony, and I'm delighted to be here. It's always a treat to get a chance to talk about your work and the ideas you think are interesting. But you're of course about to experience yet another case of the very large end set of there is no such thing as a free lunch. So now you pay the piper. My understanding is that the time allotted is till about 1:30, and I'll go for a while, and there'll be time for Q&A. I do have probably a bit too much to present. Tony and I talked a couple of months ago about what might be the most useful thing to talk about, and I opted for, instead of all the details of a particular paper or a particular research question, to provide a kind of broad overview of a research agenda I've been embarking on for quite some time. So what you're going to see is a PowerPoint that's probably crammed a little bit full, but it has no tables. It has, however, a set of findings, a lot of findings. Behind those findings, there are lots of tables, and actually, I think on my flash drive, I could dredge one up if you really want to see details of one or another set of studies. But I thought the overview might be the most useful thing to present. And so I'll do that. I'll probably wander around a little bit, thanks to the wonders of technology. But I understand there's a camera sitting there, and so I'm going to be staying more in one place than I would probably ordinarily do. What I want to talk about today with you is this research agenda on public management and performance. It's not the only thing I'm focused on in my research. I could go on for a long time arguing why it's a really important subject. I won't do that. You can see from the subtitle on this first slide that, and this highlights, I guess, the emphasis I'd like to place on the work I'm going to talk about today. I've been embarked on a long-term study, often with Ken Meyer as a colleague, not always, but often, and several times with some additional colleagues as well, on an evidence-based research agenda focused on public management and performance. So you're going to hear about some of the research questions and findings in this agenda today. The main focus of this agenda, which has been a matter of intense interest to us since our first publication together on this subject was 1999. The focus is on how much and in what ways public management influences the performance of public programs. If we had a very long time, I would try to argue that there are probably managerial influences both at the organizational level, the kind of units that we typically think of as delivering public programs, and also at what one might call the network level, since I'm prepared to argue that many, quite possibly most public programs are actually executed through multiple organizations in various kinds of patterns of interdependence. Both of those levels, I would argue, are important for reasons having to do with the practicalities of research and research designs. It becomes a lot easier to talk about the organizational level than the network level. Ken Meyer and I have done some formal modeling of how we think managers probably affect programs at the network level, and we've done a little bit of empirical work. But for the most part, I'm going to leave that out of the discussion today and focus especially on the organizational level. The strategy that we've adopted to explore this question about how management influences performance is to develop and work from a formal model of management This, and you'll see it, for those of you who haven't seen it way too many times already, you'll see it in a moment. But what I want to emphasize about the model for the moment is that this doesn't descend from the heavens. Actually, it's inductively generated. That is to say, what we've done is to try to read through the literature on management and performance as it existed, especially about 10 years ago, when almost all that literature consisted of case studies. And we tried to understand what it is that the authors of the case studies were saying about managerial impacts on outputs and outcomes and programs. And it's not always clear, but we tried to look for regular patterns in the case studies and then to formalize those. So what we work from is a formal model that is very reductive, but we thought that that would be a useful approach to try to begin a systematic exploration of the management and performance agenda. As we've been proceeding, we've developed gradually quite a number of measures of management, and you'll hear about several of them today. And our research strategy has been primarily to use this formal model to sometimes simplify it for purposes of a particular study, and then to conduct large N analysis of a particular sort, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Okay. All right. If you're going to do large N studies, that is many organizations and many managers supposedly influencing performance, you face almost inevitably a sort of apples and oranges problem. That is, if you want to compare across federal agencies, for example, to pick the high performers and the low performers, let alone to explain the variance across those performances, you've got a real difficult problem because what Social Security produces is not very similar to what the Navy produces, is not very similar to what the Forest Service produces, and so on and so forth. Because of that problem, almost inevitably, a number of researchers have said, well, what we can do as a next best strategy, since we have no common metric, is to ask people how they're doing, to record systematically those responses, and then to try to see if we can analyze and explain the variance across those responses, especially by managers who, it is argued by some, should know their programs best. Well, I won't go into any depth on this point, except to say, and Tony knows this because he saw a little part of this unpacked at the American Political Science Association meetings in early September. We are pretty convinced now that perceptual measures of performance, as reported by managers, are not only very inflated, that is, you have the Lake Wobegon effect, but they're seriously biased and they're not very sophisticated, unfortunately. We have some various tests we've conducted to try to see if managers are kind of discounting their performance on the basis of the task difficulty or the characteristics of their organization or whatever. And from the evidence we've been able to gather, the answer is no. Even worse is it appears that there is common source bias. If you're asking managers how well they're doing, their organization is doing, and you're also asking them what they're doing, you get false positives. That is, managers who say they're in the forefront of innovation, and their organizations are, and they tend to score their own organizations as doing better than most. But if you take a different kind of measure of performance, an archival measure, recorded systematically across all organizations, I'm avoiding here the term objective measures. It turns out that reporting that you're in the forefront of innovation is, for our data set at least, is not at all related to performance. Yes?
But wait, do people in business administration do this for ordinary businesses?
Yeah, there is a literature on this actually. It's a relatively small literature. Most of it is indeed private sector. You sometimes see, at least in the public management literature, citations to this work and claims that perceptual and archival measures are fairly close. But if you actually take a look at the private sector studies, they're not very close. You sometimes get correlations at about the 0.5 or 0.6 level. But of course, you know, the common variance here is the square of that. So we're talking about a relatively small portion. And the most highly cited studies tend, in our judgment, are not really studies of perceptual performance at all. They're data recall. How many employees did you have last year, and you log that, and what were the total sales, and you log that. even there, the shared variance is about 0.6. So there is a literature. It is sometimes used by public management researchers to claim that this is not a bad way to study performance.
What's shocking is that they don't do, the people in the private sector studies, business schools don't do a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. And by all rights, it should be easier in the private sector since, for the most part, you can at least agree on one or two bottom lines. In the public sector, it's a more difficult problem. There are also fewer studies, and by our in our judgment, on the basis of our studies, the perceptual measures are not to be trusted. This doesn't mean that, for example, citizens' perceptions are irrelevant, and it may even be that frontline workers might have something useful to add here. We haven't done any systematic analysis of that. But because of this apples and oranges problem and the problem of perception, we have, in our research strategy, relied on archival measures. Okay? And so what I'm going to report on today is relationships between management and performance, using as performance a set of archival measures from a data set that we've been working with for some time. So the basic approach is to treat those archival measures seriously, take a look at a set of organizations that are apples and apples and apples. That is to say, they're supposed to be doing more or less the same kind of thing, albeit in different places. And then that allows us to use a fairly standard production function in a given policy area, so insert a set of controls and see what, if any, relationship there is between management and performance. Okay? So that's the approach. And in terms of a few assumptions undergirding the theory, this slide summarizes several. We treat public organizations as inertial or autoregressive systems. What they're producing today is a lot like what they produced yesterday, not exactly, but a lot. There are features of organizations that stabilize that production, including structural elements. However, of course, public organizations, as all organizations, are open systems, and so they are not completely encased in protection. And then, of course, management is a crucial part of this research agenda, and we treat management as encompassing at least some different functions. Here, I've sort of separated out three. Management inside the organization, and there's all kinds of stuff that's embraced by the notion of internal management. If you take a look at a lot of the standard public management textbooks, they're full of discussions of internal management. There's also, of course, management externally, in the networked environment and externally in the broader environment. Managers can presumably assist production by buffering the organization from unwanted shocks and or exploiting opportunities, resources, other kinds of things in the organization's environment. Also, our reading of the case study literature suggests that those who've studied very carefully individual cases seem to be reporting that management is not just another input to production, but rather that it interacts with various features. And so this suggests to us a nonlinear model rather than simply adding a measure of management to a standard linear multiple regression. So, okay, we formalize these ideas. There's a piece that originally presents this in JPART in 1999. And here's the model. It's modified slightly from the original model produced in '99, but I won't get into that unless there are questions. Basically, outcomes at any time t, the model suggests, are a function of, and two terms here. The first term is the inertial or autoregressive term. There's a function of outcomes yesterday and some aspects of management and some aspects of the stabilizing forces, okay, which are treated in the model as propping up that autoregressive function, okay? So M1 is internal management here. The second term of the model is the portion that explicitly incorporates influences from the environment. And the X sub t term here is a vector of environmental forces at time t, stabilizing elements outward from the organization, and these often include structural ones. And then the M3 to M4 ratio is the exploiting to buffering ratio. You'll notice in the second term that denominator of the full term an SM4, and you'll see that late in this presentation. That's in effect the buffering that the organization does and with management to stabilize production. So that's the model. It's highly reductive, as I say. It's got management in 3 places. And incidentally, what we typically have been measuring is not exploiting or buffering by managers, but rather their externally oriented activity, and we call that M2. I'll get to that in just a moment. Because the model is so reductive, there's a lot that seems packed into these M's, and I'll do a little bit of unpacking of that today, but only some. Okay, so where have we carried this, this strategy and this research agenda? We've done some work, or at least I've done some work on law enforcement. We've done some work in higher education. We have a data set, which we think actually is not a really good data set, in part because we surveyed not just university presidents, but deans, and we get a pretty good response rate, believe it or not, from university presidents, and a really wretched response rate from deans. And so we had really wanted to incorporate that level of management. But we've been working on higher education. We may continue to do that. As Peter knows probably better than anyone, and Tony also, we've done some work in local management in the UK, specifically in England, with some British colleagues. We are now underway gathering additional data in public education in 2 countries in Western Europe, Denmark and the Netherlands, also with research colleagues in these 2 countries. So you've seen, or you would not have seen any work from these data published as of yet, because we're still in the data gathering phase. We have a survey in the field now, surveying hospital managers across the US. So we hope in a few months we will have data in on US hospitals and not just public ones. And we are, with a colleague elsewhere, we are in the process of designing a survey that is intended for managers of nursing homes. Again, not just public ones. So it's a variety of policy sectors. We're trying to sort of expand this agenda. I say that also to say that, as some of you know, most of the empirical work that we've done thus far, and it has been reported in the literature, has been on public education in Texas. And so most of the findings I'm going to discuss in just a moment come from that last data set. But we're in the process of trying to expand in other areas. Okay? All right, a little tiny bit about public education in Texas, because this audience probably knows a fair amount about public education in general in the US. So we're talking in Texas about independent school districts. All of the cases, all of the observations in the data I'm discussing here are from independent school districts. By the definition of the Census Bureau, these are all independent governments. They're headed by a top manager, the superintendent. They're not the same as, in terms of boundaries, as the cities. In fact, Houston has a bunch of these independent districts. They have their own taxing and bonding powers. They have a fair amount of discretion on their curriculum. They have a lot of management authority. And whereas in some states, teachers' associations or unions would be a really important part of the mix, in the case of Texas, they are extremely weak. Here's just a little bit about the funding of these units of government, these organizations. The districts themselves generate a fair amount of their money. Most of the rest of it comes from the state. And the state also imposes on each district the requirements stipulated in an accountability system. More about that in a moment. There's a bit of money from the federal government. No Child Left Behind obviously matters. Texas is the birthplace of No Child Left Behind. So this accountability system has been in place now for a little over 25 years. So there are data going back that far. The federal government's interest and influence primarily has to do with equity considerations, not so much money. It's a big system, not as big as California, but as you see, 4.7 million students and more than 1,000 school districts. That is, 1 out of every 14 school districts in the country is located in Texas. They're all supposed to be doing public education, but aside from that, they are highly varied on many other dimensions, including race and ethnicity, also finances and so forth. Okay? This slide shows 7 management measures that we've developed and used in this data set. And I'm going to go through as many of them as I can within the allotted time. We may get a little bit hurried toward the end. But I wanted to give you a sense of sort of how the use of the model and the attempt to test systematically small parts of it has been playing out. Okay? Here's where our data come from for this set of studies. Most of the data are recorded archivally by the Texas Education Agency. They are the ones that gather the performance data annually, and performance data on a number of different dimensions. They have the finance data, the data on personnel, including measures of human capital in each school district. And then we supplement those data with surveys of the top managers in these districts. And I've listed the dates when we have actually executed the survey. The word hurricane at the end of that line indicates that after the hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we actually added another survey in the field right after that because we were looking for how managers cope with unanticipated shocks from the environment. In this case, not just budgetary shocks, but literal shocks and shocks that play out in a variety of ways. So those are the surveys. Those of you who do work on public management know very well that performance and finances and personnel data are important, but among the more difficult kinds of data to get access to in a systematic way is what managers are actually up to. And there are very few ways of doing this without asking them. And so these surveys are designed to elicit from the top managers of the districts how they spend their time, what their goals are, what strategies they adopt, and a variety of similar items. The surveys are fairly short. They've lengthened a bit over time. The response rates range from a low of 55% in the first survey to a high of the mid to upper 60% in later surveys. The last one, 2009, is down again a little bit. We thought we were training the superintendents to respond to any surveys requested, but actually as we elongated the survey and we invited some other management scholars to add some questions to the survey, that's probably suppressed response at least a bit. These districts are representative of the broader set of Texas school districts by most measures that we can tap. Okay, so I'm about to launch into the discussion of that first management measure and its relationship to performance. Anything before I jump in there? Okay. Well, we started in effect with the second term of the model. And we did that in part because I have a lot of interest in management in network settings. But we have not been able to and cannot sketch for all 1,000 districts the full network in which these actors operate and validate all of the dyads and so forth. So unlike the work of, say, Keith Provan and Brent Millward, where they go and trace out the entire structure of networks, but that then limits them to a very small number of networks to examine, we have, in effect, sketched the ego network of the top managers across these school districts. So we asked the top managers, the superintendents, with whom they interact and how often. And we started out with a fairly low number of external actors, and that's listed here in the first sub-bullet. And we've gradually, over time, added actors to the set of actors. We asked them about interactions. How often and with whom do you interact? From daily to never across this set of actors. It turns out, if you, at least for our data set, if you add quite a number of actors, and you see some additional ones listed in the second bullet there, and then you factor analyze the results, those two factors, that is the factor from the small number of nodes and the factor from the larger number of nodes elicited, are very highly correlated at typically 0.96, 0.97, or maybe a little higher. So we get essentially the same factor score regardless of how many nodes we ask about. It's obviously crucial to ask about the most important ones to get that result. So we've always included that earlier set in all additional surveys. The factor analysis across all these surveys has always produced a single significant factor. That's our measure of managerial networking, M2, back in the model. And it appears to be, and this was a bit of a surprise to us, a personal rather than organizational characteristic. I expected that there would be features of the organizational setting that would be driving some of this networking behavior. We've explored this in a number of ways. maybe the easiest way to see what we found is for me to report to you that when we ask about networking and the same manager is in place over a 2-year period, we get correlations on that measure of about 0.55 and a little higher. Okay, not bad for a behavioral measure over a 2-year period. When the manager is swapped out, the correlation is essentially 0. So this does not seem to be interactions driven by the stakeholders in the environment, at least primarily. It seems to be a style or a characteristic of the manager, him or herself. Okay, and then on to performance. We have a measure of networking. Performance for school districts, like all public organizations, is multidimensional. There are more than one thing that these school districts are being asked to do. You see here a number of the kinds of performance measures that are recorded archivally by the Texas Education Agency. There's a standardized test required in the state. It's a high stakes test at 1 grade, and it is the single most salient performance measure in the state. Scores on this make front page news in local newspapers and websites. Some of the superintendents actually have clauses written into their contracts indicating bonuses for higher statewide standardized test scores.
What year is that?
I'm sorry?
What year is that? School year?
The high stakes test, 11th.
By the way, is that high case relatively graded or absolutely graded?
It's absolutely graded, and our measure is the percent of the students, and I'll put a footnote in here in a moment, but the percent of the students in a district who pass all parts of the standardized exam.
That's fine.
Okay. The footnote is that districts have some arcane rules operating by which they can exempt certain students, and so it is possible for the districts to game a little bit. In a number of these studies, we have actually tried to sort that out and focus on, in effect, the same kinds of students in all the districts. The Texas Education Agency also requires that those test scores be reported for certain subgroups of students, specifically for white students, African American students, Latino students, and low-income students. Low income being defined as those who get reduced or free school lunches. So there are performance reports for those subgroups. There's also these additional kinds of measures, some high-end measures, college prep measures. The state, for example, requires that districts report what portion of their students who take either the SAT or the ACT score above a certain level that the state deems to be college ready. There are scores about, or there are archival measures of advanced placement test taking, advanced placement scoring at level 3 or above. And then there are some low-end performance measures, specifically attendance and dropouts. It's going to be really hard to educate students if they don't show up. So all of these are measured and reported annually. And the production function we use is, in effect, these 8 control variables in all of the equations, and these are all estimated with standard OLS, multiple regression. So 5 measures of resources and 3 of task difficulty. And then in many of the studies, as the model would suggest, we include the lag-dependent variable. Okay, so the equations would have the control variables, the lag-dependent variable, and then 1 or more measures of management estimating performance. Okay, so what do we find? In the case of managerial networking, we find focusing on the standardized statewide examination, that's the high salient performance measure, we find consistently positive impacts on test scores. The maximum effect size, about 4 to 6%. That may not sound like a lot, but it can be a lot, and especially if you think of these districts as autoregressive systems, so you build on a base and can grow that over time. We also find, as the model suggests, that there's some interaction with managerial networking and some, but not all of the resources that are in the equation. And we see especially strong effects with teacher salaries and with class size, not with some of the others. That makes sense to us, right? Managers make choices about where they're going to put their emphasis. And so we see interaction effects with some, but not all of the resource measures. We also, as we analyze our data, find what we call an autoregressive paradox. It turns out that the lowest performing systems are the ones who have the highest inertial value. That is to say, they seem more trapped by prior production. Okay, so the lag-dependent variable for the low-performing systems explains considerably more of the variance than for the high-performing systems. Similarly, we also find that the higher the levels of managerial networking, the lower the autoregressive parameter, or the impact of the lag-dependent variable. So as managers network more, relatively speaking, and controlling for all those other variables, we find that the systems are able to perform more differently than they did the year before. And we think, although we do not have survey data to suggest this, that part of what's going on here is that managers are able to try new things and they can build on their base. They can tap opportunities that they might otherwise be so, they might otherwise be so engaged with internal operations that they might not be able to do it. So more networking seems to be related to a smaller inertial value in the equations. Okay, so sounds good so far, right? Networking is a good thing. And indeed, a lot of the literature on networks and networking suggests one or more versions of networking is a good thing. Sometimes the literature almost seems to suggest that if we could all somehow just join hands and walk forward together collaboratively and understand and appreciate each other and co-produce like crazy, the world would be a better place and many public problems would be ameliorated. Well, obviously I'm being a little sarcastic, but there is a very positive spin to a lot of that literature, especially that touches on collaboration and cooperation. You see the last bullet down here. There's a dual meaning to collaboration, as some of you may know, right? It could mean co-production, we work together. It could also mean co-optation, as in collaborators during wartime or whatever. And indeed, we have decided to explore systematically whether there's evidence of co-optation in the networking behaviors of these top managers. And here's what we find. We find that networking matters positively for performance, and you see under this first bullet, for a whole set of performance measures. But notice they have something in common. They're either highly salient or these are performance measures that would be most salient to the more advantaged constituencies or clients of public education systems. There are, however, negative impacts, and these are also quite systematically negative impacts on networking for the least privileged stakeholders in public education, right? Latino and Black students, low-income students, and attendance, which is also a measure, a kind of low-end measure that is most important for students who are especially challenged in terms of the lack of resources outside the school system itself.
So
yeah.
Just a point of clarification.
Sure.
You're saying that for teachers who are networking, the results of their networking are less effective when they're dealing with Latino students, Black students? Is that what you're
No, it would be, except for the fact that we have not surveyed the teachers. So this is the reported networking behavior of the top managers.
Of the managers.
Of the managers, right? We've never...
So if I were to re-edit what I just said, substituting managers for teachers, then
right.
That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's right.
Is there a possibility essentially that those places are plum jobs and that better networked people get into them in the first place?
We've tried to explore that issue, and we don't see that happening. We've tried to explain, well, in some studies aimed at the determinants of networking, we've tried to understand what's really driving that, and we've had almost no success explaining that. We get very small R-squares, and we don't really know what's driving the networking. We've tried to analyze patterns of migration of superintendents across districts, because that does happen. It's a fairly mobile labor market. But we don't see that. There is some, I'm about to report some data on salaries, which is related to another aspect of what we're doing. But there are plum jobs, clearly.
There also may be the fact that if I'm in one of those places that actually has more resources, I may have more opportunities to go to conferences. I may have may spend less time putting out fires, may have more time to refine.
Right. Now, we don't see strong relationships between the resource measures and the networking measure.
They don't?
We don't, no. So, you know, there's some mysteries embedded in these findings. Okay. But what we do see is the table gets tilted, right? Those who are relatively privileged benefit from the externally oriented activities of top managers. And we assume, we can't know for sure in an analysis like this, we assume this is certainly not malevolent. That is to say, the networking behaviors of top managers probably puts them in regular contact more with business leaders and with elites in their community than with those who are relatively marginalized. We do have a little bit supporting that in an additional analysis we've done. But Dan?
I don't want to distract you
Sure.
from this, but it's a fascinating issue about
Sure.
this. Could it be the top managers are in a culture of networking related to parents, and you haven't picked that up? That is, how do parents communicate with their principals? And if you're in a world where it's via email or text or whatever it is today, that creates a different atmosphere than if you're one where they do not use that as a mode of communication.
Right, and we haven't separated out modes of communication. We have actually tried to see whether networking is related to perceived parental support, and there is a positive relationship.
And how parents communicate with you.
You're right, and that we haven't explored in any depth. You're right, Tony.
Do you see any differences, like if within your data set, you do have some changes in you don't have much of a change in terms of Texas governor, but you do have some changes across political administrations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when President Bush is in the White House, right, Secretary of Education and used to be the superintendent of a Houston ISD and so on and so forth. It just, the whole relationship makes me think that because these things are independent governments, one thing that happens is they're created in areas, and maybe they're subdivided in areas where it's politically salient to do so, right? And so maybe some of these ISDs just have better connections because of the way they were created, and that's a structural impact, which you said really wasn't that strong. Have you looked at that?
Have not looked at that, and that's possible. I don't have a good grasp at this moment of the sort of time series that is when the great majority of these were created, or what the sort of impetus was for relatively new ones. So haven't even begun to explore that. I should maybe add that on some of the relationship between politicos and administrators in these systems, we have done some work. And on the sort of politics and administration dimensions of some of this, there's a book that Ken and I produced in 2006 that Johns Hopkins published, The Bureaucracy in a Democratic State. What I'm reporting on now are all the sort of management findings, or a subset of the management findings, and we do have, this is a time for the new book plug, we do have a forthcoming book in production at Cambridge. It's called Public Management, Organizations, Governance, and Performance. And some of these findings and some other ones from some of the other data sets are included there. Mentioning governance reminds me to say this is a governance salon, and maybe I should have said this explicitly at the beginning. Governance is a complicated business. We are here ignoring significant parts of the governance system, as Tony's question sort of politely suggested, but we are focused on the management and performance part, okay, with some on what Lynn, Heinrich, and Hill would call operations. Okay. We did, I guess, 50 regressions, taking the 5 nodes that we were especially interested in and putting them in and out of the regression equations one by one for each of 10 performance measures to try to see how those individual interactions were affecting performance. And what we found was, kind of interestingly, professional interaction, superintendents interacting with other superintendents, that would be in other districts. Primarily, we think in terms of technical assistance, getting advice about problem solving and so on, is positively related to performance for the less advantaged students. Interactions with business leaders in the local community is negatively related. And interaction with political nodes seems to favor more or less the status quo. There doesn't seem to be a relationship there. So not all nodes are created equal, and there are distributional impacts. Are there diminishing marginal returns? The answer is yes. Again, the literature is mostly positive about networking and collaboration, but we find diminishing returns. A couple qualifications. The nonlinear aspect gets ironed out when you control for managerial quality, a concept and a measure I haven't yet talked about, but I will in just a moment. And when there's more central management capacity, as measured by the percent of staff that's in the central office. So here's a slide summarizing that set of findings. Basically, networking matters. It can add to performance, but not for everybody. There are distributional impacts. There are also there's some evidence of nonlinear impacts, and that's the set of findings for one of our management measures. I just mentioned quality, and what you'll notice if you look back at that original model I had up is that there are management terms, but I didn't say anything about quantity and quality, and so implicitly we've been measuring the quantity of networking, but not about how good a networker in the sense of are you dealing with the right people at the right time to get things done, not to mention any other aspects of management quality. But presumably all those M's include both a quantity and a quality aspect. But how do you measure management quality? And this is a conundrum, and we don't have a general answer for this. We know that quality, all the literature suggests quality matters. But how do you tap, especially in time series, an assessment of quality for managers located in different places doing similar but not exactly the same tasks, when maybe in one district they need to be doing certain kinds of things and in another district they need to be doing something else. There's not much of a consensus in the literature about how you get at this, and especially at the individual level, that is the manager, not just the organization. Getting a measurement of managerial quality is a really tough job. So here's what we've done, and this approach seems to work pretty well for these kinds of data. It would not work well for all kinds of civil service data, but let me walk you through what we've done here. Who knows, presumably, the quality of the local top manager? It would be people who are dealing regularly with that school system, especially the political principals in that system, not the school principals, but the school boards. All right? The school board's job is to focus only on education and to presumably work on behalf of the interests of public education in that system. They interact often with the top manager, and they make annual salary determinations. In this particular instance, it's a pretty unconstrained labor market. This looks a lot like a neoclassical labor market. These people move around. The salaries are public information. The performance in each district is public information. It's all available to any of us if you want to go to the website. And so under the assumption that there is a model for top, there is a market for top managers. What we've done is to tap a very small literature on the salary, the determinants of salary in public education. And we've used that in regressions to explain the great bulk of the salary variance, and it's the residual from the salary equation that we would argue is correlated with some assessment of quality. So we have a salary equation. This is drawn from the literature, including a number of measures of the district size, the human capital, and the personal characteristics of the manager. Do you have a hand up? Oh, okay. Because of the reciprocal relationship that we would expect between salaries and performance, we purged this with an instrumental variables technique. We did the original analysis for those 5 years listed on this slide. We've replicated more recent years. It's very consistent. The original equation explained 78% of the variance across salaries. In the most recent analysis in later years we've done, it was 0.80. So this works pretty well to explain salaries, but not completely. And so it's the residual from the salary equation that has measurement error, but we think would presumably be correlated with the local school board's assessment of how well that manager is doing. And that's our quality measure. We use it in equations across 10 performance measures with the same control variables we mentioned earlier, also with the same networking measure that we had. With the networking measure in or out, the results are the same. In 9 of the 10 equations, this measure of quality is positively and statistically significantly related to performance, okay? And the maximum effect size is roughly the same as it was for networking.
What kind of error, you say maximum size is 4 to 6%?
4 to 6, yeah.
Yeah, what kind of error would you put on that?
Well,
It's so small that I'm worried that it's, you know, I believe it.
well, a couple things to say. One is we can't expect, given all those resource measures and task difficulty measures, for management to be moving mountains, especially in a relatively short period. So an effect size of 4 to 6%, I would argue, is not trivial. In addition, what's not obvious here is that the networking measure is totally uncorrelated with the quality measure. So the cumulated impact of management on performance with just these two measures is more like 8 to 12%.
But I'm asking a different
Okay.
question. I'm saying you measure, you give an effect. I presume your regressions tell you how that 4 to 6% is plus or minus what? Am I missing?
The range here, this is the maximum effect size.
Yes,
okay?
I know, but what's the error on it?
And the range here indicates the range across performance measures.
That's not
Okay.
correct. I must be missing something.
He's giving you the range.
Huh?
He's giving you the range.
He's giving you that.
Range.
He's giving you a confidence interval.
He's giving you his confidence interval
Yeah.
on the 4 to 6%.
It's 4 to 6. Oh, you're saying that
Yeah.
it's really 4 to 6 plus, in other
So
words, about
maybe
5
the
plus or
mean
minus
is-
2%.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what he's saying.
yeah.
All right,
Okay.
fine. So it could be not crazy to think that the effect is purely grading.
It would be quite unlikely, I think.
No, if you ask for, never mind.
No, it's fair enough. One question actually that this does lead me to think about. So obviously I'm having had my hair gray trying to measure latent concepts. I'm not, I think this is a very difficult but important thing to do. But given this, the way this residualization is constructed, what I'm concerned about is high variability in this thing across your sample. Can you talk at all, even qualitatively, about what was going on during this period that might suggest that, if salaries were increasing, or if there were other of these variables that were very unstable that might be exaggerating this kind of thing?
Right.
So it's related to what Martin is saying, but it's based on your measure of quality.
Gotcha, yeah. Yeah, I can say a little bit, but we haven't done any systematic analysis of it. The original set of studies on the quality measure, which is what I'm reporting here, is several years old, and during that time, it was good times in public education in Texas. The budgets were growing, the salaries were growing, the performance measures were also improving. In fact, at one point, a little after this period of time, the state recalibrated its statewide standardized exam supposedly to ratchet it up, although you get very high correlations between the old exam pass rates and the new exam pass rates. But so it was good times. We have done, but not as carefully as the original set, studies more recently, precisely because of that. And we do get positive effects, but I can't remember offhand across all the performance measures. So the relationship seems to hold, but it's much tighter budget times, and we haven't done a really systematic analysis.
It would also be interesting to know whether or not the job of the superintendent was changing in any discernible way. So if for example, because they're ISDs, they can change the terms of the superintendent's contract without some sort of centralized thing. So there could be a waive or some non-random change in what these folks actually have to do to achieve those performance outcomes.
Yeah, that could happen, and I don't have any information on that really of a systematic sort. It also, I should add, there's another kind of measurement error here, and that is that some of the superintendent's contracts include non-monetary compensation, and that's left out. This is just the straight salary.
So this comment might go back to the hurricane effect.
That's possible as well. So
Yeah.
non-monetary, like they get houses and stuff.
Cars, country club memberships.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Use of credit cards.
I wonder whether there's a component to your entire research project that you actually went out and talked to those superintendents and see how networking really, why it would disadvantage the minorities?
Right. Yeah.
What would be a reason you learned directly?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. We have done some of that as well, more on certain of the studies than on others. We've done some of that on networking, and but what we've not done is systematically sample for qualitative interviews. We've done some telephone interviews with superintendents on some of these specific questions, and we've also sent some grad students out into the field to interview a bunch of them. And on networking, and also on a set of findings, which I'm not going to report on today, on what drives contracting out in school districts. Our intuitions seem largely confirmed by what the superintendents tell us. Now that I've mentioned contracting out, let me just say on the side, it seems unrelated to the performance of the district. That is, the extent of contracting doesn't explain any performance in the districts. It may, on some measures, actually be negatively related. And so we then tried to explore why some districts contract out a lot and some don't. And there we have an interesting set of findings. But the superintendents largely report that they are contracting out for a couple of reasons. They contract out because it's all the rage. It's the education version of the new public management. So for the years we examined, there was lots of discussions of contracting at meetings and professional associations and so on. Also, as it turns out, and this is kind of bizarre, once you hire contractors, once you hire people in your office to handle contracting, they tend to look for more contracting. And so the percent of central office staff is related to the percent of contracting, percent of the budget in contracting, and vice versa. And with a Granger causality analysis, both seem to be driving each other. So, and those findings are ones we were especially interested in, and so we did explore those with a number of superintendents. But you point also to one of the downsides of systematically doing large N analyses one after another, and that is without using some qualitative methods as well, you may be missing part of the causal story. Okay. Yes?
Is there any variation in the structure of school districts, such as some might be more akin to our charter schools, more might be akin to more of a direct hierarchical structure?
Yeah.
So I know you said we weren't talking about governance, but did you look at those kind of variables?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because it gives me a chance to clarify. There are a few hundred charters in Texas, and we have omitted them from this analysis for precisely that reason. That is, the structural variation is great. Within the data set I'm talking about here, not much structural variation except for the size. We've left unanalyzed until very recently the charters data. There are a couple of reasons for that, but we're now embarked on an initial analysis with a couple of research questions on the charters.
And are there any privates? Are there any private schools?
Oh yeah, there are private schools, and we have not surveyed any of them. Yeah. The charters act a lot like privates in some cases, of course. And although they're supposed to be non-denominational, some of them have very religious names in Texas. And so
that was another question.
Okay.
Is the religious schools?
Yeah, no, we've public education only, and for the reason that you initially mentioned, we've tried to do these analyses only in the kind of standard issue school districts. But we have the charters data, and we have no data on privates. No, I'm sure the sector matters on that, but we haven't done any studies. Okay. All right, we're through 2 management measures. And I'm going to go a little faster on some of these unless you want to stop and talk about them. You remember the first term of the model, you had a couple of things propping up the autoregressive or the lag-dependent variable, internal management and also stability. Well, one might argue that personnel stability, there are lots of kinds of stability in an organization. One might argue that personnel stability is kind of part of that stability vector, but it's also kind of management. Certainly, the stability of personnel is something related to management. So either way you treat it, it appears in the same term in the model. And of course, in the last 10 to 12 years, there's been a lot of discussion of the virtues of innovation, change, adaptation, and so on. Right? The Ford Foundation funds the Innovations in Government project. We have books on innovation and entrepreneurs as managers, and so on and so forth. The new public management touts some of these themes. But of course, a traditional claim in the literature on bureaucracy is that there are some real advantages to stability. And so stability has a lot of dimensions. What we've done, because we have data, is to focus on personnel stability. We'd really like, by the way, and haven't been able to do it, to do some examination of curriculum stability in school districts, because our hypothesis would easily be that a lot of what's going on in school districts in Texas and elsewhere is curriculum churn, with consultants traveling around the country selling the latest magic bullet and so on, and school districts adopt one after another curriculum. And we think that's probably negatively related to performance, but we don't have the data. We do have the data on personnel. And there are two kinds of personnel stability we've been examining. One is the stability of the frontline teachers. Okay, so we don't have teacher networking data, but we do have teacher stability data. So 1 minus the annual teacher turnover rate is our measure of frontline stability in these districts. And then managerial stability, and our measure here is the number of years that the top manager has been employed in any capacity by that district. And we do the analysis the same way as I've been talking about earlier, same 8 controls, and including the networking and the quality measure in the equations. And here's what we find. For that most salient performance measure, stability of both is positively related, even with the lag-dependent variable in the equation. With 9 other performance-dependent variables, 7 of the 9 equations show one or both of those personnel stability measures positively affecting performance. The effect size, again, is about similar to the earlier studies I was talking about. In the autoregressive estimation, 6 of the 9 equations show one or both stability measures positively related to performance. And there are some nonlinear relationships among the management measures here. Okay? So those are, in effect, 2 more measures related to management, and also, in this case, to stability. Okay. What about M1? Internal management. Internal management is most of Hal Rainey's book on understanding and managing public organizations. It's a great deal of what POSCorp was all about, and certainly managers are doing lots of things within their organizations to stabilize and improve performance. We have a huge literature on this. We have taken one small slice of internal management and tried to estimate its impact on performance, and that is human capital management. We all know about human capital crisis, so-called, at the U.S. national level. There are problems in other governments as well. This is one aspect of internal management. There's not much of a literature that we can find testing HRM on public organizational performance. We have some survey items that get us a little bit toward examining that. The second bullet here lists 5 items we questioned top managers about. We asked them about the quality of their middle managers. We asked them about the quality of their teachers. We asked them about the extent to which they had development programs for their staff. We asked them to respond to the statement, our people can make any program work, in a Likert scale set of responses. And we asked them whether they had a subordinate that they would recommend, one or more subordinates that they would recommend as a top manager in a different district, which we took as a way of a polite way of asking whether they had trained their successor. All of these items load on one factor with a decent eigenvalue. I won't go into the reliability testing, but the measure seems reliable over a 2-year period. This is developed from a more recent survey. We didn't have it in the earlier surveys. So in the estimations, we include the other measures that I've been talking about earlier today. Same set of controls, 10 performance measures again. And we find strong relationships in 10 of the 10 equations, or in 9 of the 10 autoregressive equations, with a larger maximum effect size for this HRM measure than for the other management measures. Now you might say, and I'm suspicious of this, well, they may be estimating the quality of their teachers really high because their test scores are high. And so we've tried to do causality analysis on this, and we get ambiguous results. We need a longer time series, and so we'll be gathering more data and try to sort out the relationships, the cause-effect relationships here. Anything else on this?
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Trying to make comparisons with other professional organizations in which you promote public professionals for the technical skills, but they have no background in management whatsoever. And they make them hospital managers who can't manage anything, okay? And I hate to say that about schools as well. You get very good performing teachers who become principals, but they have no background in management, and they never get any training, and they never get tested.
Okay, so I can intuit a question out of that. You're right, and I think the same can be said about top managers in Texas. One thing is you can say, well, let's tap a human capital measure. Have they had advanced training in public education? But it turns out most of these superintendents have doctorates in education. Okay. And think what you will about doctoral programs in education. That's the major part of their training. Most of them are also active in their statewide professional association. The human capital measures like extent of advanced training are in the salary equation that I talked about earlier. But you're right, of course. Top managers may or may not have any management skills. Interestingly, this is a slightly different point. We have as one of the control variables in terms of resources, teacher experience. That is the average number of years that a teacher has been employed in public education. And it turns out that has a kind of ambiguous relationship to performance. Sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative. Fairly frequently it's not significant. And partly that's newer teachers presumably have less experience. On the other hand, they have better training of a more recent sort. And so you have the old dogs, new tricks problem there.
I wanted to add a footnote. I've been at USC for some time, and I've never yet persuaded the management of USC to send their people to either our school or the business school for courses which would much benefit the university if they took some.
Right.
And you can't persuade, we have rated national courses and teachers in this, and some of the people who do come are actually manipulated out of the courses because all their timetables are changed so they can't attend class.
Yeah. This is not a problem unique to the local setting. One thing, by the way, that Texas has done to try to address this at the teachers level is to try to, now they've enacted a regulation that you cannot be certified in a substantive subject unless you have taken courses to major in that substantive subject at the undergraduate level. So rather than math education, it's mathematics. So, but that's a different issue than management. Okay? All right, there's more to management. I'll slog through a few more of these. There is the, again, second term of the model and impacts or shocks positively or negatively from the environment. Sometimes those shocks penetrate the organization. Sometimes they don't, they're buffered out. Sometimes they do, and they penetrate. We've been able to examine that. We've also done this with some of the hurricane data, but what I'm reporting here is shocked in terms of a sizable budget cut. And we define sizable as more than 10% year over year from the trend line, okay? And about 8% of the year over year budget changes are negative at 10% or more. So this happens with enough frequency to be interesting. Part of a negative shock on budget could be anticipated because some of it's enrollment driven, but part of it cannot be. So some of this at least is unanticipated. Of those that are 10% or more, the average cut year over year is 18%. So these can be pretty big shocks to the system. And this slide only has the bare outlines of it, but what we've done is to try to take a look at what's going on in those cases where districts are experiencing sizable budget shocks one year to the next. And the first thing that we notice is that you don't see many performance impacts, at least immediately. Of the 10 performance measures that we have typically been using, we only see 2 that where there are negative hits for sizable budget cuts year over year. And within 2 years, those negative hits disappear in terms of statistical significance. So we've tried to explore what's going on, what are managers doing, if anything, when those negative budget hits occur. And we find very subtle shifts in staffing patterns and in the allocation of funds across various specialties and so forth. And so we have about 8 or 9 tables where we've explored this, and it clearly seems to be the case that managers are making small shifts to protect core programs and to protect performance on some key metrics when the budget crises hit. Also, for the 2 performance equations where there are negative hits, management capacity, again measured here as a percent of the staff that are in the central office, mitigates the negative performance impacts. And we've done a little bit of qualitative interviewing here, and what appears to be going on, the best we can tell, is that some of these central staff can be deployed or allocated to deal with some of the most urgent problems. That is, rather than putting one more teacher in the classroom, they can go to deal with you know, a crisis at this or that school. At least in a temporary nature. This is also a bit of a perverse set of findings, because if it is the case that managerial moves in the short to medium term can protect the organization against negative performance subsequent to a budget shock, it becomes well, 2 things. One is over the very much longer term, this could be highly detrimental. We haven't examined that. But also, this evidence would be politically charged. That is to say, legislators and others, school boards might say, well, your budget is cut and you're still doing fine. What's the big problem? Stop crying wolf. Your management skills are taking care of the problem. So in the short term, at least, it can look that way. In the longer term, we're more concerned. Okay. I've talked just for a few moments there about what happens when shocks, in this case budgetary shocks, penetrate the organization. But also shocks can be, to some extent, some of the times buffered. Yes?
Laura, your previous point, did you have any indication of what the management strategies were when they went through budget reductions to increase performance? Because if you can identify any systemic behaviors, then that really is an indication of productivity increases.
Small increases in class sizes, leaving some positions vacant and filling some specialized positions with, instead of, for example, special education teachers, more generic subject matter teachers, reducing funding on gifted programs. You know, these are incremental changes in these various ways. But yes, those kinds of moves, you know, which might cause us also ancillary staff reductions. Okay, so folks outside of the classroom. Some of these are the sorts of moves that we see, and they're, I suppose, to be anticipated or expected under these circumstances. But I mean, as management scholars and as analysts of the data, I wouldn't be all that comfortable saying you could do this year over year for a number of years. You know, we all know about deferred maintenance programs, and we all know about hiring freezes and the kinds of sometimes inequitable results that can be produced where you're losing people from the most marketable units and so on and so forth. But in the short term, that is to say over a 2-year period, these kinds of moves do seem to mitigate performance reductions. The performance reductions where they did occur, by the way, were occurring primarily for high-end students to begin with. Most of the performance measures, we saw no negative impact even of the budget cuts. But college prep is where the performance dropped immediately. Okay. Well, sometimes shocks penetrate organizations, but at least the model that we've been using suggests that organizations and managers can sometimes try to buffer or protect the organizations from some shocks that occur. There's not much of a literature, we all talk about buffering, there's not much of a literature sort of specifying the forms that buffering might occur. And we can think of at least 3 types, right? You could have, as a buffer for an organization or anything else, a seawall for that matter, some sort of barrier which protects the organization from any shock below some certain amplitude, right? So long as it doesn't hit that amplitude, the organization's protected. That would be one kind of a buffer. It could be a selective filter, right? Certain kinds of anticipated shocks on certain subjects get filtered out by certain units of the organization. Or it could be a dampener, right? A shock hits the organization and there's something about the organization that reduces the amplitude of that shock even if it penetrates. If you think back to the model I had on the second or third slide, that model implicitly treats buffers as dampeners. Okay, so we could specify a different buffering form. We haven't done it, and in the analysis we've done of buffering, we've been trying to treat buffering as a dampening function. Of course, the expectation is that well-functioning buffering would assist performance when shocks are aimed at the organization. So here's how we've been thinking about trying to get at this buffering notion. Well, if shocks do partially penetrate an organization, the more quickly they dissipate, the less the negative performance impact. And therefore, we would expect the more loosely coupled the organization, the more buffering, because in terms of the autoregressive term, the impact of a shock at time 1 and time 2, 3, and 4 dissipates more quickly if the organization is more loosely coupled. What we did then to try to estimate the impact of buffering is to take a set of years of data prior to the ones that we want to analyze for the same organization to create an autoregressive or an inertial parameter, a measure of tight or loose coupling. And then using that measure as a measure of buffering, see whether buffering assists performance during the years subsequent. And so we used the 86 to 1994 data to create the buffering measure. And then we analyzed performance over the 8 years following that. Several other measures of management that we've talked about already, the usual controls, and we find that buffering, which in terms of the formal model is the SM4 in the second term in the denominator, right? It's partly structural and it's partly managerial, but we don't have separate measures of those. That's how we've been conceiving of it. For 8 of the 10 performance measures, we get buffering helping in a statistically significant fashion. We then tried to see whether it's related in the specific functional form that the model specifies, and we see no clear evidence that the reciprocal form of the term is a better specification than just a standard linear specification for buffering. So buffering clearly helps performance by our measure of buffering. But using the Occam's razor principle that unless there's clear evidence that this more complicated specification is superior, we should go with a simpler measure. So for the moment at least, this is one part of the model where we don't have any evidence in support. We have evidence in support of buffering, but not evidence in terms of the nonlinear reciprocal complicated version of the specification. Okay? Yeah.
One question that goes beyond what you cover is, since I study environmental regulatory enforcement, so in that literature there's a big portion of it talking about your enforcement strategy, how it impacts your overall performance. Strategy being like, do you adopt a more collaborative or coercive approach? I don't know whether that's pertinent to education. Does the educator's philosophy or approach to education makes a difference? I think that should be a big thing. Right? Would that be part of your managerial variable?
It could be. We have, and I haven't put it up in this presentation, we have tried to explore strategy from the generic management literature on strategy. So for example, the Miles and Snow depiction of organizations as prospectors, defenders, reactors, or analyzers. And we get some interesting results. Contrary to a lot of the literature on managerial strategy, and contrary to some of our British colleagues who've been looking at this in English local authorities, we find our measure of defending, that is sticking to the knitting, trying to do the best of what we're doing now rather than innovating and exploring. We find managerial or organizational defending positively related to performance and prospecting not. But that's the only version of managerial strategy that we've been exploring so far. But you're right. I mean, as you put it, educational philosophy might well matter, and we've asked about goals, but we haven't asked about philosophy. In terms of goals, incidentally, we can all decry these statewide standardized exams with high stakes attached and so on and so forth. But I would argue that if we're going to see any managerial impacts in school districts, if there is such an exam, we ought to see it on that highly salient measure. Maybe more importantly, if you ask these superintendents what their top goal is, more than 2/3 say it's performance on the statewide exam. So in that sense, they are more defenders than anything else. Okay.
Did you
Yeah.
look at John's question in the non-managerial and the policy arena, where you had innovation as opposed to maintaining?
No, we've done no surveying of the school boards, for example, and we've until now done no surveying of the middle management level, that is the school principals. We're getting ready a massive survey of school principals, but since there are more than 8,000 of them, this is a pretty big undertaking. So keep in mind, that's another aspect of the Management Matters theme here. This is it's an important but a relatively limited slice of management. Well, lots of different things that top managers are doing, but we were leaving out management at the school level, for example, except in those very rare cases, and there are some in Texas, where the district is so small that the school principal is also the district superintendent. There are a few of those. Okay, last slide. So what have we got? I think it's all pretty clear. I think we've been able to demonstrate that you can develop multiple measures of management through survey research. There are 7 in this presentation. We all kind of knew already that management matters, but it's kind of nice to know how much it matters and in what ways. We find parts of the model validated, parts of the model still subject to question. Interestingly, especially to me, since there's a literature on what makes for good managers and whether managers are born or made and all that kind of stuff, leaving aside the huge and somewhat ambiguous literature on leadership. If you do simple correlations across these 7 measures of management, only one of those correlations is, in our data, is above 0.11. And that one's at 0.2 something. So to me, this is highly provocative for what we think we're doing when we're training managers and when we're hiring managers. If we know a manager is a frequent networker, that tells us nothing about whether that manager is high quality in terms of our measure of quality. It also tells us nothing about whether the personnel in the district are going to be stable. These are not negatively related, they're just basically not related. This does mean, though, that both the management seems to be multidimensional, and also that to the extent that these are totally uncorrelated, and it's close to that, you can sum up these separate impacts of different slices of management. And so the maximum effect size here is probably approaching 0.3, that is 30%. So great managers, whoever they might be, don't turn miserably failing districts into striking successes, certainly overnight. Resources matter, task difficulty matters, and so forth. But management can make quite a significant difference. This is not an argument for managerialism. This doesn't say the solution is to find the next managerial superhero. But it does suggest that a research program of this sort, using a data set constructed this way, so you've got lots of organizations supposedly doing much the same kinds of things, allows for you to advance a research agenda like this, fairly progressively over a period of time. Okay, there's time for a few more questions. Peter.
Yes, there's quite a large sort of research tradition within educational studies itself, which is really looking at kind of the statistical determinants of performance, and it's been kind of led by kind of social statisticians like Harvey Goldstein from University of Education in London, for example. And the basic approach is really, it's kind of quite data intensive. But what they do is they take test scores from all students. They then have various data on a kind of school level. And kind of what's interesting is one of the various determinants of performance. And actually, in fact, the whole kind of branch of statistics and multi-level modeling actually came out to solve that problem. Because what they were interested in was the kind of school effect, and whether you can actually decompose the school effect from the individual effects. That kind of really very data intensive, where you've got a large number of variables. And I'm wondering what's the dialogue between your research tradition and theirs? Because I imagine if they were looking at you, they'd be saying, right, you've got this kind of one instrument, this kind of one survey, large amounts of measurement error, and you're kind of throwing away kind of vast amounts of data which you've been analysing. You know, these kind of studies have been going on for decades, huge funded stuff. So I kind of think they'd be kind of scratching their heads. I mean, is there a way to kind of put these things together? Because I imagine if you do, you know, use that kind of tradition, you have so much more of a kind of powerful statistical and explanatory model.
Right. Well, I think there is the possibility of doing that, and you're right about the sort of disconnect. I guess the most honest way of responding is to say we started out not expecting to spend 12 years with this data set, and as you can see, we've been in the process of trying to develop some other ones. But more recently, we have been at work trying to get data to do some of the multi-level work. So this school principal survey is about to go out as well. It's going to be large, and as you suggest, it's going to require us to get involved with some additional literature as well. But we haven't done it yet. One of the places where we're more likely to hit that earlier is in the Danish work that I mentioned briefly, because we're going to have school level data in Denmark for all Danish public schools, and we'll have it in 2 different subjects, and we're going to be surveying teachers as well. So we'll have the governance system, we'll have the management of the individual schools, and we'll have the we'll have the teachers, and then for a subset of students, we can match the data to data on individual characteristics for several thousand students, socioeconomic status, parents' immigrant background, all that kind of stuff. But that's in very early stages. So I think it is possible, and we haven't done it. We're going to be trying to do some of that. Yes.
Also, I have a question about the variables. I think in the models, you think that you take the Latin American students and the Black students and the low-income students. You have 3 constraints, right?
I have 3 what, I'm sorry?
Constraints.
Yeah.
And I think the low-income students and the Latin American and the Black American, they cannot exclude each other.
We enter them separately as variables. These are not dummy variables, right? So for a given school district, we have the percent of students who are Latino, the percent that are African American, and the percent that are low income.
I think low income may include students who are Latin American or Black American. So they affect each other. So it is not a reliable variable.
In some of the estimations for some of the resource measures, there's collinearity, but as it turns out, not significant collinearity among those 3 test difficulty variables. It doesn't seem to be a problem.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I want to thank Larry very much for this presentation.